Welcome to Black History Matters 2022, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, also known as NAHOF, located in Peterborough, New York. Black History Matters is an educational series that seeks to highlight historical events in the Black American experience. This series consists of 28 videos that NAHOF will release daily throughout the month of February 2022. Videos are viewable on NAHOF's website. The mission of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is to honor anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of the struggle, and strive to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Jan DeAmicis. Jan graduated from Dartmouth College in 1967 and spent the next 4 years in the Air Force. He earned his master's and Ph.D. at the University of Massachusetts. He moved with his wife and 3-year-old son to Australia in 1974 to study Americans who had immigrated there for his Ph.D. research. Jan taught sociology at Utica College from 1977 through 2016. His research focused on Oneida County African American history, and he went on to publish articles on local slavery, such as For Sale, Young Black Women, and 19th and 20th century Black family structure, including To Those Who Have Brought Me Up. In 2001, Jan helped establish and remains co-chair of the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission to study the abolitionist movement and Underground Railroad. Together, the commission has discovered many sites and people that were involved in the Underground Railroad, none of which were known before. Recently, they installed a 6-sign self-guided walking tour, Utica's Freedom Trail. Jan also serves on the boards of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum and the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State. Please keep in mind that the following presentation is part 2 of a 2-part series. Although he will be discussing new sites of resistance, please watch Jan's first video on our YouTube channel, published on February 5th, in order to catch up with the material he will be discussing today. I'd like to now invite Jan to continue his presentation.
We're now going to go to Hillcrest Cemetery and the Paris Hill Freedom Seekers in the town of Paris. Now, this is part of a map of Oneida County, and we are now south and to the west of Utica, located in Paris. This is Route 12 now. And if you come up Route 12, you come to the top of that hill, and here you are on Paris Hill. At the very northernmost part of the cemetery on Paris Hill, you have this little cemetery. And I'll talk about that in a second. We know the story because John Thomas talked about it in years later, how he ended up escaping from Maryland, arriving in Utica. A Black barber in Utica on Post Street took Thomas and another fugitive, guided them to a white Underground Railroad station master, Wesley Bailey, nearby, a couple blocks away. Wesley Bailey directs them to Paris Hill. And when they get to Paris Hill, they find themselves amidst 5 other freedom seekers who have been living in Paris Hill in the middle of this white community. And this white community not only gave them places, but they also provided them with employment. Working on local road projects and working on local farms, and found themselves with a kind of Freedom Trail community of other freedom seekers who were living there. Eventually, they purchased a home there. So you have a group of 7 people who are defying the law. They could have been arrested at any time, but it would have been a difficult thing to do because they were heavily protected by the white abolitionists who lived there, so much so that they were all not only protected, but allowed and encouraged to live there, bought a house there, and lived there until the last of them passed away. We know a lot of this because here are their graves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are no names on any of these graves except on this one here. These are unnamed. I've had an archaeologist look them over very closely. They can't find anything that indicates who they are, in which grave, and we're not going to be digging anybody up or anything. But we know a lot about them just from this one sign. And here you go. And here's what that sign says: in memory of John Roberts, Mary, his wife, and 5 friends born in slavery found home and freedom at Paris between 1846 and 1881, when the last one of them died. One of the most poignant places to stand and contemplate abolitionism and slavery and the resistance to slavery is to stand in that cemetery and just look out over the hills. It's really at the top of a beautiful, scenic, hilly countryside. Agriculture is the dominant industry there, and there are no African Americans living there now. Once these people died, that was the end of that. We know that they bought a house. J.E. Thompson, Roberts, and Thomas, those are the freedom seekers who lived there, and their house was right there, and we think that's it. But we have to do a deed search to double check that the house is the right age. It's located at the right place on the map. It would be really exciting if we could figure out that actually this is where they bought the house. But we got to take another step to do that. One of the white abolitionists who helped was Val Pierce. This house still stands. I've been in there. I've looked at the basement and walked around and talked to the owners. The house is the right age. The structure is the original structure. He was one of several who gave employment to these people. Now we're going to skip to a place, not a place, but an activity, the National Negro Convention movement between 1830 and the end of the Civil War. These are some quotes that tell you the sorts of things that they were doing, but what this was all about was free men of color, and this was only in the North, of course, there weren't that many in the South. Free men of color organized and met on a regular basis to not only discuss the problems that free Black people were facing, for instance, difficult to vote, difficult to participate in organized activities. They wanted not only freedom for themselves without restrictions, but they also agitated on behalf of enslaved Africans, their brothers and sisters held in the South. And so they held regular meetings. And regular meetings, they finally could express their complaints and could finally express their hatred and abhorrence of enslaved brothers and sisters down in the South. They finally had a way to speak as a body. This is the first time that you had an African-American nationwide organization, and in this case, dedicated to not only the problems of free Blacks everywhere, but especially to the problems of enslavement. And here you had a way for them finally to have a voice. These are some of the people who attended some of those meetings. These are all from Utica. And as a matter of fact, some became officers. For instance, James Fountain reports from the committee. T. Woodson, don't really know what his first name was, delivers a report. He's Remus Robinson's correspondence committee. They were not just going to these meetings; they were actually helping to run the meetings and helping to organize the agendas. Now we're coming to Joshua Howe. This has been one of my favorite places, one of my biggest sources of frustration as well. We are now going to look at the Valley View Golf Course in Utica, New York, in looking for this rock, this 6-ton boulder, Joshua Howe's home. Located on the very edge of the western edge of Utica, it had once been part of New Hartford, but New Hartford turned it over to Utica, now part of the Roscoe Conklin Park, which is a glorious park in the middle of Utica. Also the site of where Joshua Howe's cabin and memorial stood. We know a lot about Howe. We know much of the story because he had to proclaim in writing that he had been born a slave and had purchased his freedom. We know where he lived, New Hartford. We get that from the census as well. We know that his household included 5 children and a white wife. He appears first in the 1810s US Census and is the first African-American living in the town of New Hartford. We know he protected freedom seekers. The Gora refers to a stretch of unsurveyed land that he lived on for a while. We think he's buried in a local cemetery. We can't find evidence. We don't know when he died. But somehow, Thomas Proctor, one of the richest men in Utica in 1915, he dedicated a 6-ton boulder to Joshua Howe as an Underground Railroad station master. Now, I don't know where he found out that Joshua Howe was an Underground Railroad station master, but his memory and his reputation lived well into the 20th century. Proctor sets up this boulder and says, later on, we're going to put a plaque on it. Now, we know where the boulder should be. We think we know where his grave should be. We know where the plaque should be. We know where his cabin should be, but we can't find any of these things. But let me tell you, we've tried really hard to find it. Here's some of the information we have. Here, Joshua Howe had to swear before a Oneida County judge that he, in fact, was a free man of color. And what's really poignant is here's Joshua Howe's signature, his mark, right? Standing before Judge Miller. So we know he had been enslaved. We know who the slaver was. We know about when he came to Oneida County. We know that's what the rock should look like. Now, how big is a 6-ton rock? I talked to geologists at Utica College, and of course she said, well, it depends. But roughly it would be about shoulder high to someone like me. I'm 6 foot tall, probably about 4 or 5 feet wide, made of granite. That's about what it would have looked like, but there's nothing to measure it by in the background here. This is a 1915 newspaper picture, and there's no way to get the scale of things, but they had to put a plaque on this rock, but it wasn't there when they dedicated the rock. They were going to put the plaque there later on. Now, how do we know where it was? Because the newspaper said, well, there's a flagpole nearby, and we found the flagpole. There was a pond nearby, and we found the pond. So we know where to look for where his house ought to be. So I took some people up there. We made many trips. We're going to find that doggone boulder and maybe find out where he lived. And for this, I enlisted the aid of my colleagues from Utica College, geologist Adam Schoonemaker, Sharon Canfush, Tom Christ, and Helen Blouet are archaeologists and anthropologists. One of our many trips, he's holding a device to help, a magnetometer. We made our way up to the 5th green. It's at the farthest southern edge of the golf course. And looky there, there's the pond. See these mounds? We're going to come back to these mounds in a couple of minutes. These are people from the committee from way back. They're no longer on the committee. The committee has seen a number of people come and go. We found where the flagpole was. Schoonemaker found this. He's the geologist. Here's Ellen Blouet, an archaeologist, and Sharon Canfush, another geologist. We could see, you can't see it. There's a little rock right about here. And we thought, that's the only rock around. Is this the rock? Well, no. We thought, well, if it's that big, maybe it's like 6 feet underground. But no, we dug it up. It wasn't 6 feet underground. It's barely hidden. She's looking for evidence the plaque was there. So she's taking this, this metal detector and walked on. No, couldn't find any evidence of a plaque. Dug up around it, you could see the rock is really not very deep. Found 19th century fragments like these, pottery and so forth, but we couldn't specifically associate the fragments with Joshua Howe's homestead because there had been other development at that site over the years, including Joshua Howe. So we knew that there had been at least one cabin in the area. We went looking around. And we even brought in archaeologists from Fort Drum, which is up north from here, and they brought their ground penetrating radar system. I don't know if you've ever seen how you actually do ground penetrating radar, but you have to set up a grid. In this case, it was 10 yards by 10 yards, and then you systematically run this receiver over that grid in a patterned way, and the information appears on a computer. Amy Fidchenko from the National Park, she was a park ranger at local Fort Stanwix. Michael Sprouse is one of the archaeologists from Fort Drum. And it appears like this. Well, I don't know what the heck that means, but the archaeologist basically says there's something under there. It's not natural. We can't say exactly what it is, but you're going to have to dig it up to find out. That's what surface testing is all about. And that's as far as we've been able to get, because who knows where you start to dig. But the consuming question that I always had, I don't care where the cabin was. I want to find that rock, that 6-ton boulder. Where is that 6-ton boulder? There are no boulders around. Well, a 1936 newspaper article from the Utica Daily Press comments that people on the Works Projects Administration, WPA, you know that during the Depression, men were employed by the government to help develop places like city parks and so forth. And they were helping to develop the golf course here. And they got to the 5th green here and they found that there were big boulders around. And they weren't quite sure what to do about that because, you know, they wanted a nice flat green here. So we know that there was big boulders here on the green. And we think, no, I'm certain of it, it's under one of these 2 mounds. Now, we know it didn't have a metal plaque on it because Adam Schoonemaker took his metal detector and walked all around these mounds. So we're sure there's a boulder there. Now, how do I know? Because on none of the other greens in this golf course do you find mounds. Only on this green. What did they do with that boulder? They didn't know what to do with it. You couldn't really move it very well. Let's just bury it. And I think that's exactly what it is. So we're not going to go looking for it because the plaque isn't there. But someday we want to put a plaque up. This is a very important site to actually identify an African American who was not only an Underground Railroad operative, but had been enslaved himself and had been recognized by the white power structure, Thomas Proctor, as having been involved in the Underground Railroad. If we could find that boulder, boy, would that change things. Well, we're going to put up our own. We'll put up our own sign one of these days. Now we're going to go to the next source of resistance, the Civil War veterans from Oneida County. And probably everyone knows that Black people fought in the Civil War. Probably few people know that about 180,000 Black soldiers, not only in the Army, but also in the Navy, fought in the Civil War and were actually crucial to the victory that was finally won. The 54th Massachusetts was one of the first Black regiments organized. And the 54th also, I'm looking here at the grave of Charles Lloyd. These are in Forest Lawn Cemetery, by the way, in Utica. It's the big cemetery right in the middle of Proctor Park. If you ever saw Glory, it was based on the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, and you saw them at Fort Wagner when they attacked the fort. Well, the 54th Massachusetts was involved in other battles as well. These are 2 of the most significant ones. We don't know if Reverend Child picked up a musket, but he was certainly part of that regiment. Eli Bayless, 3rd U.S. Colored Cavalry in Mississippi. Cornelius Harding, 54th Massachusetts, Fort Wagner, Olustee, Honey Hill. These are very important battles in the Civil War. Henry Morrison and so forth. You could not enlist in a Black regiment in Oneida County. You had to go someplace else. They had to go to Massachusetts to join the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. And it wasn't until later in 1863 and early 64 that the recruitment of African Americans by the federal government started to take place. And in Oneida County, Black men were at the forefront of the rush to join the Union Army. Now we're going to move to another story, the Charles Wills family farm. This is located in the town of New Hartford. Here's Utica. We're heading west to New Hartford. This is part of New Hartford right here. It's about 10 miles from the center of the city, 20 miles. No, 10 miles. I'll give it that. The Charles Wills family farm on Paris Road in the town of New Hartford. A good, prosperous 67-acre farm. The house that was built is still there. We know because of the oral tradition, I'll give you the information in a couple of minutes, that it was an Underground Railroad station operated by the Charles Wills family, and Charles Wills was an African American. We know that he donated money to the United Institute. We know that he signed abolitionist petitions. We know that he supported abolitionist newspapers, and we're certain that he helped freedom seekers because his house is right square in the middle of the trip from Utica up to Paris Hill. Remember, we looked at Paris Hill where the cemetery was. His house is square in the middle of the only way to get to Paris Hill. We're certain that he protected freedom seekers. This is a precious picture. We have no pictures, photographs of African Americans before the Civil War from Oneida County. It's very hard to find. And to find one who was actively involved in the abolition movement is very, very precious. Not only was he a middle-class African-American farmer, but he was also part of the project, part of the movement. That's what his house looks like. That's what it looks like today. A member of our Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission, Mary Hayes Gordon, she lives there. And that's how we know about Charles Wills. Because when she moved in, a neighbor wrote this note. Your house was part of the Underground Railroad, an organization which helped Black slaved people travel from southern US to Canada. They were seeking their freedom. A few Black people remained here. You have a picture of Mr. Wills, who at the time owned your house. And it goes on to talk about how this lore, this story of the house being part of the Underground Railroad had been passed on ever since Wills had passed away. Here's an example. This is Charles Wills. It's hard to read, these old petitions. Charles Wills, so he signed this petition. We're sure he signed others, protesting slavery. The problem with these petitions, thousands, tens of thousands of petitions were sent not only from Oneida County to Congress, but all across the North. And tens and tens of thousands were sent to Congress, and eventually the Congress, which was dominated by slave-owning politicians, they declared the gag order. We're not going to listen to any more petitions. We're not going to even accept them. We're not going to pay any attention to you people who are protesting slavery. For a while, these petitions were just kind of dumped here and there. But eventually the gag order was rescinded, and eventually the effort to try to use persuasion with these petitions continued. From Oneida County, I have gathered dozens of these petitions. I had to go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to do it, and that's where I found this one as well. Now we're going to go to the Florence Farming Association, town of Florence. Here's Utica. Here's Paris, right? And here's New Hartford. Now we're going to go to one of the extreme corners of Oneida County into the town of Florence. The Florence Farming Association, sometimes called the Florence Farming and Lumber Association. We know about when it started. We know that Garrett Smith owned thousands of acres of land in New York and donated thousands of acres to African Americans, hoping to make them qualified to vote. If you were a Black male, you could only vote if you had several $100s worth of property. It was not a restriction that was laid on white men, only Black men. If you didn't own property, you couldn't vote. And so he's trying to make this African American population, hold on, I'll get that in a second, turn them into not only property owners, but voters, to give them a voice in the political process. So he looks around, finds an agent Stephen Myers in Albany, and he starts to recruit people, African Americans, for this Florence Farming Association. Now, there was nothing there. It was wild woodlands. It's difficult to grow anything there. The water table is very, very high. It's rocky, there's a lot of shale, it's hilly. It's very poor for agriculture. So they were starting from scratch. They were going to have to cut down the trees and build their own buildings and so forth. But they started off as a formal organization with a president and a vice president and a committee for this and a committee for that. And the idea was that they were going to create a self-sustaining Black community. They were going to have a church, they were going to have a school, they were going to have industries, they were going to cut down the trees and burn the trees, get the ash and turn it into potash for fertilizer. They were going to build a newspaper that will have it. There was going to be a self-sustaining Black community. It wasn't the only one in the United States that was attempted, but it's almost totally unknown until one of our members, Jessica Harney, started to look into it. We know that at least half a dozen of the 2 or 3 dozen people who ended up there were freedom seekers. They were actively being sought by the law to recapture them. They were on this Florence Farming Association and lived openly for a while, trying to establish themselves as farmers. We found at least one of these farms. Most of the land is privately owned, but some of the land is owned by the state, and we've been able to explore on the state and found the structures or the foundation of these structures nearby. We can't find any trace of the settlement after 1860. When I said it was a formal structure, it was known elsewhere. We see that it's known in Wisconsin, for crying out loud, that they wrote an article about this Florence farming settlement, the colored settlement in Florence, Garrett Smith's colored settlement. So other people knew about it. That's how we know it was there, was because newspapers proclaimed it. We can see the kind of things that these people did. They misspelled his name. I didn't misspell his name. They traveled around, they spread the word, they went looking for money. Newspapers reported on this all the time. And I said it had a very definite structure. It wasn't just a bunch of people living there. There's the president, vice president, treasurer, and here are the names of the people. The president, Peter Freeman of Utica, vice president, John Williams. I have emphasized Walter Hawkins. He moves there with his small family, and he is a runaway slave. And he is living out in the open. I mean, he's making himself plainly visible by being on this the governing structure. And you can see the plans that they had. Here's the village of Florence and the old Florence Road. And you got to know where it is in order to get down Florence Hill. Here's the village of Florence Hill. And you go up this road, and then you're going to take another road, and it was a dirt road right at the very end. You had to know it was there. And Walter Hawkins, we think that's the site of there's his name, Walter Hawkins, right? Walter Hawkins, we know his story because he eventually left because of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that all white citizens were required to cooperate in apprehending escaped slaves. If you helped an escaped slave, you could be fined $1,000. Well, back in 1860, 1850, $1,000 was worth $75,000 today. That's a hefty fine. You could be put in jail if you helped a freedom seeker. Moreover, the law said that if a sheriff demanded you be part of a posse to help recapture a fugitive, you had to go with the sheriff. Well, that meant that all Black people were now at risk. Remember, no photographs. All a slave catcher had to do was point at somebody, and that person, could be sent into slavery. Anyone who saw 12 Years a Slave knows how that could have happened. But people who were in fact fugitives themselves, they were especially endangered. So Hawkins takes his family and runs away. There is now, well, I have another story there, a sign, that's a Pomeroy sign, that celebrates this Florence Farming Association. They couldn't put a lot of information on the farm. That's Jessica Harney. She's the woman who got the sign erected there. She did a lot of work to do that. The sad story is that within the last week, we have learned that someone stole that doggone sign, and we don't know where it is right now. We're going to try to find out if they stole it because they wanted the medal or if they stole it out of a racist motivation. We don't know, but it's really sad. It's really because the work she put in, we're going to find a way to replace it. The state archaeologist, the state library, the state of New York has been actively cooperating to develop this site. And this is one of their archaeological maps. And they have found evidence of walls. There is a apple tree grove that had to be planted there. It wasn't natural. Evidence of barns. They found a well. So they found, this is Maple Hill Road. This is the road that you would travel. This is where the sign would be right here. And so we think that this was the area where Walter Hawkins and his family ended up living. So the state's been involved. Jessica Harney has also taken her high school students, and they have done a lot of the mapping and so forth. It's being developed as a major site of African-American life in Oneida County. But by 1860, it was gone. No trace of it after 1860. We can see that in 1840, before it was established, there were only 4 Black people in the entire town of Florence. 10 years later, now the Black residents start to appear. Now they're starting to dig out farms. They're starting to organize the Florence Farming Association. 10 years later, there are still 27 Black people in Florence, but that's a big drop. And we assume that most of the rest ran away because they were afraid of being captured or recaptured. After 1860, we find no printed evidence, no newspaper articles. And you can see that the number of Black people in Florence only includes a couple of farmers, just a couple of farmers. And after 1920, there are no Black farmers there is all. So it was a failed experiment, but nonetheless, it was another way that you could resist slavery, by simply living your life out in the open. Why did it disappear? Well, let me tell you again that the land is marginal, and I walked around there. If you go there in the spring, it is so boggy. You know, you're slopping around in mud, and the water table is so high that pools form. You couldn't really grow very much there. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 frightened a lot of former enslaved people, but also free people of color, because they didn't know if they would be going to be captured and erroneously claimed to be a slave. That had something to do with it. We know that these people were poor to begin with when they showed up, and mostly they were city people. They were not farmers. They were going to have to learn how to farm in the process. Well, if you showed up and you got rocky, watery, swampy ground, you got to cut the trees down before you can make a penny of income. Well, how do you pay your taxes? I mean, you were being taxed. Even if you didn't live there, you were the owner of the land, you had to pay a tax. And if you couldn't get any money off of your investment of energy, how are you going to pay that tax? So eventually, most of the land, we think, ends up being going into arrears for taxation. We don't know. We can talk about the possibility of internal conflict amongst the people. Did they all agree on the goals? Did they all agree on how it would be managed and so forth? We're not sure. We're not sure if neighbors, white neighbors, resisted this small Black community. We don't really know exactly, but we do know that by 1860, there's no evidence of it anymore. The points I want to make are this. First of all, we saw that there were very few Black people in Oneida County. Some places there were no Black people, maybe just 1 or 2. The city of Utica had the largest concentration, but even then, very tiny part of the population. We know that they were amongst the poorest of people. We know the kind of jobs they did. We've gotten this from the US Census. Many of them simply say laborer. Women would often mention that they were maids. Men might mention that they were barbers. But they were of the most menial occupations that you would find anywhere in the North. So they were small in number, and they were humble in their occupations. They had no political power. First of all, there weren't enough of them to be politically important. And second of all, remember, you had to own property if you were a male. Women couldn't vote then. So that because numbers were small, their occupations were poor, they had very little wealth and very little property. They had no political power at all. So you could say they were a very insignificant part of the county and that their role would have been marginal. But they were essential. Remember I said that if you were a runaway slave, the first person you're looking to for help would be a black face, probably a friendly face, probably almost entirely comfortable. And that black face would help guide you to the next place where you could find help. So if you did not have this population on Post Street, remember a lot of black people end up protecting fugitives on Post Street, you would not have had so many fugitives coming through Oneida County. They had to find a place of security while they looked for the next station. And Post Street allowed them to hide, and activists, black activists from Post Street interacted with white activists who lived nearby and elsewhere. And the white activists would never have seen these fugitives except they had come to Post Street first. They were essential, not only in Oneida County, but everywhere across the North. Black people and white people interacted for the first time in history in a common cause on the basis of equal standing. White people respected the role that black people were playing, and black people knew they needed white people to continue the success. Essential, though, that you had a black population that was ready, willing, and able to help protect fugitives. We know that the small population of African Americans in Oneida County, they were connected to local organizations, statewide organizations, and the national network of abolitionists. Remember the national Black meeting group that was allowed black abolitionists to join with others across the country. We know they worked closely with white abolitionists, and they had an outsized influence. By outsized, I mean the size of the population was small. The work they did was humble and gained no public acknowledgement. They had no political influence. Nonetheless, without their help, the Underground Railroad simply would not have existed to any scale in Oneida County. They were absolutely essential, and I call that an outsized influence in supporting the abolition movement. And finally, we have to say that it was a remarkably active Black American anti-slavery support movement taking place in Oneida County, and has gained very little recognition until the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission started to look into it. Now, I sound like I gathered all this information by myself. I did not. I did the PowerPoint, but the information comes from a variety of places. The people who are now serving on the Freedom Trail Commission, as well as people who served on it in the past. All I have done is gather some of the information on my own, but have taken information that other people have done and have put it together in this PowerPoint. I want to be sure that it's not that the tribute should not just be paid to me. And I want to let people know that we have a website here, the UnitedCountyFreedomTrail.com, and then would encourage you to join us as we try to fill out the story of abolitionism in Oneida County. And that's it.
Thank you, Jan, for your contribution of this presentation. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, the Oneida County Freedom Trail website is linked in the video description. Please help us by completing a brief survey available at the link on your screen and also in the video description box. Feedback will help NAHOF receive funding and help plan future projects. Additionally, please contact NAHOF with any questions and if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. Once again, thank you, Jan, for donating your time and contributing to this program. And thank you, the audience, for joining us on this educational journey, Black History Matters. We hope to see you at our next presentation.